Well, with all of the disagreements that we could potentially have this year and more multiplying every day, I think there's one thing that almost everyone should be able to agree on, and that's that 2020 is just awful, isn't it? It's like the worst year ever, seems like. I recently bought a T-shirt that basically summarizes exactly how I feel about this year here. I actually did buy that T-shirt. I love it. It's my new favorite T-shirt. Yeah, I think that you would honestly be hard-pressed to find a year quite like this one if you were to look back through the pages of history. However, I do think that the year 1933 would be a close contender with 2020 for a simply miserable year, especially if you lived in Germany. In 1933, it had only been 15 years since the end of World War I, a war that Germany decisively lost and which continued to haunt and to impoverish the German people. It had only been through 13 years since the Spanish flu. That's when we used to know how to have good pandemics, the Spanish flu, right? But it had only been 13 years since countless lives had been lost in Germany due to the Spanish flu. The international scene was in turmoil. If you opened up a newspaper in 1933, you would see that there were civil wars raging in Catalonia, Spain. Japan had just invaded China and was ravaging that country in their quest for power in the Pacific. The prime ministers of Romania and Greece both resigned back to back. And in January of 1933, Nazis began to march through the streets of Berlin with torches demanding that Adolf Hitler be named Chancellor of Germany. At one point, a huge brawl actually broke out between communists and fascists in the streets of Berlin. There was rioting, there was broken glass, people were being killed. And if you were alive at that time, it would seem to you as if the whole world was on fire. Well, on Sunday, January 15th of 1933, just 2 weeks before the German election, which would elect Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. In the morning after riots had broken out in the streets of Berlin, a pastor named Dietrich Bonhoeffer preached a sermon about hope to his tired, scared, beleaguered congregation in Berlin, Germany. Listen to how Bonhoeffer opens up this sermon. He says, the Bible, the gospel, Christ, the church, the faith, all are one great battle cry against fear in the lives of human beings. Fear is somehow or other the archenemy itself. It crouches in people's hearts. It hollows out their insides until their resistance and strength are spent and they suddenly break down. Fear secretly gnaws and eats away at all the ties that bind a person to God and to others. Have you ever seen someone in the grip of fear? It is dreadful in a child, but even more dreadful in an adult. The staring eyes, the shivering like an animal, the pleading attempts to defend oneself. Fear takes away a person's humanity. Well, we live in a time of great fear, not unlike the time in which Bonhoeffer lived. Bonhoeffer then continues in his sermon to address a very short and yet very profound story from the life of Christ. It's a short story. It's only a few verses long. But it was a story that Bonhoeffer's congregation needed to hear on January 15th of 1933. And I'm convinced that it's a story that we need to hear this morning. We spent the last couple of weeks exploring what we called a theology of hope. And right at the outset, we said that Christian hope is the confident assurance that all of God's word is true, and that all of God's promises to do good to you will come to pass. And then last week, we dove a little bit deeper into the foundation of our hope. What is the reason Christians can have hope? And we said it is the absolute sovereignty of God over all things, which assures us of three certainties in uncertain times: that God has not abdicated his throne, that God is able to save, and that God does his best work when things look the worst. Well, this morning, what I'd like to do is kind of tie everything together by exploring this particular story from the life of Christ. It's a story in which we find the disciples much afraid. Much like the people in Bonhoeffer's day were afraid, much like many of God's people in our own day are afraid. This is also a story about the fact that Jesus refuses to leave us adrift on an ocean of fear and uncertainty. We serve a God and we love a great King who has actually gotten into the boat with us. And as he calms our fears, he fills our hearts with hope. I want to invite you to turn your Bibles with me to the 4th chapter of the book of Mark. Mark chapter 4. We'll be reading verses 35 through 41 and the story of Jesus calming the storm. Mark chapter 4, verses 35 through 41. It says, "On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, 'Let us go across to the other side.' And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. And other boats were with them. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling, but he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him and said to him, 'Teacher, do you not care? We are perishing.' And he awoke and rebuked the wind and the sea. 'Peace, be still.' And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And he said to them, 'Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?' And they were filled with a great fear and said to one another, 'Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?'" It's a remarkable little story. It's recorded in all three of the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It obviously made an impression on these men. What I'd like to do this morning is just kind of tell you the story of this story, kind of fill in some of the details for you. You can look at verse 35 again. It says, "On that day." Well, what day are we talking about? On that day. Mark has something specific in mind. You can turn back to the beginning of chapter 3, actually. Chapter 3, or maybe chapter 3, verse 22 would probably give you a better sense of where we are on this day. This is the longest day in the life of Christ. It's the longest day that we have recorded, I should say, in the life of Christ. I think Mark chapter 3, verse 22, all the way through the end of chapter 4, this is just one very long day. Really gives you a wonderful insight into the nature of Christ's ministry. And this particular day began with one of the most traumatic experiences in the life of Christ. Look at chapter 3, verse 22 as we start this day. It says, "Now the scribes who came down from Jerusalem." Now you can stop right there. What does that mean? The scribes who came down from Jerusalem. This is an official delegation, in other words. Jesus is starting the day with a visit from an official delegation from the religious leaders in Jerusalem. Up to this point, Jesus has been just kind of a podunk preacher up in Galilee. Galilee is like the middle of nowhere. And he's kind of been up there, and he's made a few waves in Jerusalem, and people are asking, and so somebody's got to say something. And so the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sanhedrin has sent a delegation to Galilee to say, "All right, this is what we believe about who this man is. This is the official declaration from your religious leaders, the scribes who came down from Jerusalem, were saying he is possessed by Beelzebul. And it is by the prince of demons that he casts out demons. Verse 23, he called them to him and said to them in parables, well, how can Satan cast out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. And if a house is divided against itself, that house will not be able to stand. And if Satan has risen up against himself and is divided, then he cannot stand, but is coming to an end. But no one can enter a strong man's house and plunder his goods unless he first binds the strong man, and then he indeed may plunder his house. And the summary of it all is Jesus starts this day out with the biggest conflict of his ministry career thus far. Anybody ever been in a conflict before? Sucks the life out of you. Anybody ever been in a church conflict before? Don't raise your hand. I don't want to know. It really sucks the life out of you. It makes you want to throw up. I've been involved in my share of conflicts, and I haven't relished a single one of them. I was at a church not quite a number of years ago now where every day there was a conflict. It was unbelievable. I woke up tired. It was just constant fighting. Absolutely sucked the life out of me. Well, that's how Jesus starts this day. Biggest conflict of his ministry career thus far. Keep going in chapter 3. You come to verse 31. It says, and his mother and his brothers came, and standing outside, they sent to him and called him. And a crowd was sitting around him, and they said to him, your mother and your brothers are outside seeking you. And he answered them, who are my mother and brothers? And looking about at those who sat around him, he said, here are my mother and brothers. Whoever does the will of God, he is my brother and sister and mother. We learn from the other gospel writers that the reason Jesus' family had come was to collect him because they thought he was out of his mind. If you think church conflict is hard, try family conflict. Well, after all of that, Jesus goes on to spend the rest of the day preaching. In chapter 4, he tells the parable of the sower, and then he tells the disciples the purpose of the parables. He tells the parable of a lamp under a basket, the parable of the growing seed, the parable of the mustard seed. And all of these accounts in chapter 4 are really just summaries of what Jesus was teaching. He was teaching hour after hour after hour is the takeaway. In fact, when we get to our story, it says in verse 35, on that day when evening had come, he had been teaching, he had been preaching all day long, almost into the evening, to crowds numbering in the thousands. Thousands upon thousands were coming. So many people were coming to hear him preach. He was getting crowded and pushed into the water. He had to get onto a boat and go out into the harbor a little bit so that he could preach and they could hear him without crushing him to death. This crowd had grown to just such an extent that those were the steps he had to take. And finally, we get to verse 35, and it's the end of the day, and Jesus is absolutely spent. He's got nothing left. And so verse 35, on that day, when evening had come, he said to them, let us go across to the other side. They're in Galilee. The other side means the other side of the lake. They were on the western side of the lake. He said, let's go to the eastern side of the lake. The eastern side is much less populated. There's no one there. Like, I got to get away. Verse 36 is very descriptive. It says, and leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat. That phrase, took him with them, is used elsewhere in the Gospels. And what it usually refers to is taking someone who is on the brink of collapse and virtually helpless and rescuing them from danger. That's how spent Jesus is at the end of this day. That's how exhausted he is at the end of this day. It's almost like the disciples just had to pick him up, collect him, and we got to get out of here. And I love this little editorial comment that Mark adds. Leaving the crowd, they took them with him in the boat just as he was. Remember, Mark is writing on behalf of Peter. These are Peter's memories that Mark is collecting and writing down. And Peter remembered it just like that. He'd never seen Jesus that tired. He'd never seen someone that thoroughly, emotionally, physically, spiritually, just wiped out. They took him just as he was, lay him down in the back of the boat, and let's get out of here. Now, verse 37 introduces another important character in the drama of this story. The character is the Sea of Galilee. The word sea is a little misleading, to be honest. We think of the Mediterranean Sea, and it's like an ocean, right? It's big. The Sea of Galilee is actually quite small. It's 13 miles in length, and it's about 6 miles wide. It's a lake is what it is. And you can see it right here. This is where the Sea of Galilee is in northern Israel. 13 miles in length, about 6 miles across. Something interesting about the Sea of Galilee, it is the lowest freshwater lake on the face of the earth. Sea of Galilee, lowest freshwater lake on the sea of the earth. The Sea of Galilee actually lies 690 feet below sea level. It's in a depression that's surrounded by hills. And you can kind of see this. This is the northwest corner of it. This would be kind of the Capernaum area. Most of Jesus' ministry happens in this region right here. It's a little bit more of a close-up of it. Galilee, northern Israel, is a tremendously fertile area. You can see all the crops that they're growing there. This is the Sea of Galilee by night. You kind of get a view from the other side there. But again, 13 miles long, 6 miles wide, 690 feet below sea level. Now, one other interesting thing about the Sea of Galilee. This is a picture taken from Tiberias, looking to the east, and the mountain in the background is Mount Hermon. Mount Hermon is 9,200 feet high. Again, Sea of Galilee, 690 feet below sea level. 9,200 feet high, Sea of Galilee, 690 feet below sea level. Mount Hermon's a mere 40 miles away. And those of you who know anything about climatology or the way that these kinds of things work, what happens is the cool, crisp airs from 9,200 feet up on the top of Mount Hermon will race down through the wadis and the gullies and collide with the hot air that's sitting on the Sea of Galilee. And this is something that's known to happen. This happens today. As those cool airs race down from Mount Hermon, they collide with the hot airs coming up from the Sea of Galilee, creating tempests, tremendous storms, almost instantaneously on that sea. W.M. Thompson, in his book, The Land and the Book, in 1901, wrote this. He said, "The sun had scarcely set when the wind began to rush down toward the lake, and it continued all night long, with constantly increasing violence, so that when we reached the shore the next morning, the face of the lake was like a huge boiling cauldron. The wind howled down every wadi from the northeast and the east with such fury that no effort of rowers could have brought a boat to shore at any point along the coast. The whole lake, as we had it, was lashed into a fury." And that's a very common occurrence on the Sea of Galilee. Well, that's exactly what happened to Jesus and his disciples as they were sailing to the other side of the lake. It says, leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was, and other boats were with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat so that the boat was already filling. It's interesting. Each of the gospel writers uses a slightly different word to describe this maelstrom that falls upon them on the Sea of Galilee. Mark says that it was like a howling windstorm. Like a whirlwind is the way he's describing it, like a whirlwind revolving from below and rising to the top. Matthew, I think, uses the most descriptive word to describe this storm. He says that a megaleseismos descended on the lake. Usually that word seismos is the word you'd use for an earthquake. It was as if there was a churning giant earthquake coming up from the depths of the sea, causing the waters to rise and to boil and to completely consume the boat. The waves were so high, you couldn't see the boat in the trough. They were being dashed from side to side to side to side. And to be clear, this isn't a big boat. The boat was something like this. It's just above a rowboat. They actually dug this boat out of the mud of the Sea of Galilee. Somebody found it when the lake was really low. Israel gets a large portion of their fresh water from the Sea of Galilee even today. So there's times where the lake is extremely low and you can find things like this. But that's a little boat. That's a very little boat to be tossed about on the sea in a storm of this size. And it kind of begs the question, where's Jesus in all of this? Well, he tells us, a great windstorm arose, the waves were breaking into the boat so that the boat was filling, verse 38. But he, Jesus, was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. I've been tired before. I've never been that tired, where you couldn't take a bucket of water and throw it on my face and have me not wake up. That's tired on a whole nother level. Jesus is so spent, he is so physically exhausted that not even the tossing of the boat, the howling of the wind, or the buckets of water just drenching all the inhabitants of the boat could wake him up. That's how tired he was. That's how spent he was. He was just so tired. I have to wonder, in a room this size, how many of us have come to this place just plain tired? Maybe it's your finances. Maybe you can't seem to get ahead. You feel like you're always sinking. And you can't bail out the water fast enough. And you are just so tired of it all. Or maybe it's your kids. Every time you come home, it feels like you've walked into a hurricane. And you're already tired, and now you're even more tired. Or maybe it's your job, and you just feel as if you're always behind. And the work continues to pour in. And you don't know how you're ever going to get through this, and you're just tired. Or maybe you're caring for aging parents, and you find yourself in unfamiliar waters, and you just feel lost and tired. I think for many of us, just waking up in the morning makes us tired. I know I'm tired. I'm tired of hearing about COVID. Is anybody else sick of this? I'm tired of the bitterness of this society. I'm tired of the endless wars over abortion and religious freedom and now free speech. I'm just so tired of all of it. Now, this story doesn't necessarily mean that any of those things are going to go away. But I do think it is a tender reminder that we are not alone in our tiredness. That Jesus, this same Jesus, he has lived the same life that we're living. He knows what it means to be that tired. He knows what it is to be spent and exhausted, and in a sense, at the end of yourself. And so when we come to him, when we lean on him, we do so knowing that he's been here before. And I don't know, I think there's just something that's so compelling. It's like an anchor of the soul, knowing that Christ, being man, very man, has experienced the same things I've experienced, and he made it through. And so I can hold on to him and trust him and gain strength from his fortitude. There's a new song that I love, Christ the sure and steady anchor. It goes like this: Christ the sure and steady anchor in the fury of the storm, while the winds of doubt blow through me and my sails have all been torn, in the suffering, in the sorrow, when my sinking hopes are few, I will hold fast to the anchor, for it shall never be removed. You beloved, I would just remind you this morning that there is an anchor, that he's lived the same life that we live, with all of our weaknesses and all of our frailties, and that we can come to him tired, worn out, and exhausted so that we can find strength. Well, the story picks back up in verse 38. He was in the stern, asleep on the cushion, and they woke him. And they said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And that's really an indication of how severe of a storm this is. Most of these men grew up, they spent their whole lives on the Sea of Galilee. This was nothing new. They had been in storms before, but they'd never been in a storm like this. This must have been some storm to have aged, salty fishermen wake up a retired carpenter to ask for help. And the way they do so, it's almost staccato style as you read the different gospel accounts. It all boils down to this: "Teacher, perishing. We are all perishing. Do you not care? We are all perishing." And you look at verse 40. I love Jesus' response. Why are you so afraid? Because the answer seems rather obvious, doesn't it? Why are you so afraid? There's a storm. We're soaking. The boat is sinking. But every time Jesus asks an obvious question, you can rest assured that he is getting at something. What Jesus is getting at in this story is the fact that these men really believed in their heart of hearts that God was sleeping through their storm, that he didn't care, that he wasn't there for them. And so they were genuinely afraid. Have you ever been there before? Where you wonder, where is God in this? Is he sleeping through the storms of my life? The biblical writers often did. Psalm 10, verse 1. Why, oh Yahweh, do you stand far away? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? God, you just feel so distant right now, and this storm is so real, and I just feel like I'm sinking. And where are you? Psalm 44, 22. For your sake, we are killed all the day long. We are regarded as sheep to be slaughtered. Awake! Why are you sleeping, O Lord? Rouse yourself. Do not reject us forever. One of the most beautiful uses of the Psalms is to help us express our emotions to God. Because, friend, you're not the only one who's ever felt like God had abandoned you. You're not the only one who's ever felt like God was sleeping through the storms of your life. But if you want to find the heart of Jesus in this passage, you'll find it in verse 40. He says to them, "Why are you so afraid?" And then he, in essence, answers his own question. Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith? I love how Matthew puts it. Matthew says, "Why are you afraid, O you of little faith. That word "you" of little faith, it's a fun little Greek word. It's the word oligopitos. Isn't that a great word? I love saying oligop. That's one of the reasons I like preaching this sermon, because I love that word. Why are you afraid, you oligopitos kind of men? Why are you afraid? It's because you appear to be very small faith kind of men. Jesus uses that word on a number of different occasions. Interestingly, mostly in connection with the Sea of Galilee. Most of the times Jesus uses this particular word, in Matthew's gospel at least, it's in relation to the Sea of Galilee. Mark 14:31, another account on the sea, you have Peter. This is a great account of Peter walking out on the water, and he starts to doubt, and he sinks into the water, and Jesus reaches out his hand and takes Peter, and he says, "Oh, you oligopitos, oh, you small-faithed man, why did you doubt?" Matthew 16, verse 8, as the disciples are making their way again across the Sea of Galilee, they're arguing about who was supposed to bring the bread. And Jesus again says, "Oh, you oligopitos, you small faith men. Why are you discussing among yourselves the fact that you have no bread? Didn't I just feed 5,000? Why is your faith so small?" The root issue in each of these cases where Jesus uses this word, the root issue in each of these cases is the failure of the disciples to see beyond the mere surface of things. The root failure in each of these cases is the failure of the disciples to see beyond the mere surface of the things. The disciples were afraid that there was a storm. What Jesus is saying is, I know you are concerned about the storm, but I am far more concerned about how small your faith is. Of the two, that is by far the greater problem. To be a person of great faith is to embrace and believe the fact that God is never sleeping through the storms of our lives. There will never be a point in your life where God has abandoned you or where he is not aware of what is going on in your life. You see, in the midst of every storm in your life, there is a still small voice asking a very simple question. And the question is, do you trust me? The essence of great faith is great dependence upon Christ. You see, it's in lifting our eyes up above the clouds and the thunder and the lightning of the stuff of our lives that we can find peace as we depend upon Christ and as we rest in his strong arms. Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith? Beloved, I wonder what your answer to that question would be this morning. As we find ourselves in the midst of a world that does truly seem to be on fire, and it's relentless and unending, and you have every opportunity at almost every moment of the day to cry out in fear and to believe the lie that God has forgotten you. But I think the question that Jesus asks the disciples is the same question that he asks our hearts, even in the midst of 2020. Where is your faith? can you trust me even here, even right now? Faith is believing beyond what our eyes can see. If you look around you right now, what you can see is pretty bad. But faith takes God at his word and believes even beyond what we're able to see. Verse 39, he woke, he rebuked the wind and he said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. That's a power that none of these men had ever seen before. The power to simply speak, to just open one's mouth, and the created order obeys. And so then you look at verse 41. And in the face of that kind of power, they were filled with great fear. And they said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Matthew tells us that all of the men marveled at this miracle. Mark says they were filled with great fear, or in Greek, you could actually translate it, and they feared a great fear. Luke combines the two ideas and says that they were afraid and they marveled. They were left terrified, amazed, and scared to death by the presence of someone this powerful. The disciples are starting to understand that this is no ordinary man. The Bible is filled with exhortations for believers to fear the Lord. It is a Christian duty that we would fear the Lord. Psalm 34:9 says, "Oh, fear the Lord, you his saints." Psalm 33:8 says, "Let all the earth fear the Lord. Let all the inhabitants of the world stand in awe of him." Habakkuk 3:16 describes it. "I hear and my body trembles. My lips quiver at the sound, and rottenness enters into my bones. My legs tremble beneath me. And yet I will quietly wait for the day of trouble to come upon the people who invade us." See, whatever takes up the most room in your heart is what you fear. Whatever takes up the most room in your heart is what you fear. Whatever is biggest in your heart is what you fear. We live in a society that's absolutely lost its mind in fear in the last 6 months. Fear of a virus that has a 99.986% survivability rate for those under 75. And yet, as a result of that, we've completely crashed the economy. We've put millions out of work. We've given up most of our civil liberties. All of that out of fear. All of it out of fear. For too many people, COVID-19 is just about the only thing on their mind. It's just so big to them. But what's happening in this passage is what needs to happen in our hearts. What's happening in the passage is that the disciples are beginning to just catch a glimpse of how big Christ is. Because there's only so much room in your heart. If God is small in your heart, then there's no end of things that you could be afraid of, and they will take up most of the room in your heart. But if Christ is big, a big Christ like this Christ that we find in this account, if you have a big God, then all the problems in the world all of a sudden become very small. Only a big Christ can save us from the storms that we face in life. William Cowper said it like this in his hymn, "God Moves in a Mysterious Way." God moves in a mysterious way, his wonders to perform. He plants his footsteps in the sea, and he rides upon the storm. Ye fearful saints, fresh courage take. The clouds you so much dread are big with mercy, and they shall break in blessings on your head. Well, getting back to Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he preached a sermon on January 15th, 1933. One of my favorite parts of the sermon is where Bonhoeffer describes a small ship that is on the high seas. And the ship is struggling mightily against the wind and the waves, and it's being tossed about like a toy as the sky grows ever darker and the strength of the sailors fail. And then Bonhoeffer said this. He says, then one of the sailors is gripped by something. By who? By what? He cannot tell. But someone is in the boat who was not there before. Someone comes close to him and lays cold hands on his arms as he pulls wildly on the oars. He feels his muscles freeze. He feels the strength go out of them. Suddenly, he can no longer see or hear anything. He can no longer row. A wave overwhelms him, and now the cry goes up from the whole crew. Fear! Fear is in the boat. All arms are frozen and drop their oars. All hope is lost, for fear is in the boat. And then it is as if the heavens opened and the heavenly hosts themselves raise a shout of victory in the midst of the hopelessness. Fear is in the boat, but friends, Christ too is in the boat. Christ is in the boat. And no sooner has the call gone out and been heard than fear shrinks back and the waves subside. The sea becomes calm and the boat rests on its quiet surface because Christ was in the boat. I would not venture to guess what else will happen in 2020. But I know whatever happens, Christ is in the boat. Let's pray. Father, this is a special story. It's a very short story and a very short gospel, actually, in the Gospel of Mark. But just as Pastor Bonhoeffer's congregation needed to hear that sermon in 1933, I think we needed to hear it today as well. God, as Christians, we are a people of hope. We have every reason to be a people of hope. We serve the Lord Christ. He is our anchor. He is strong and kind, and he is with us. He is in the boat. And so we can trust him. Father, we love you and we do thank you. Thank you for your word. It's so clear. It's so good. And God, it is so helpful to us as we make our way across this storm-battered sea. Father, I pray that you'd bless us as we press on and as we follow you in the days to come. For we ask it in Christ's name. Amen.